Hi, I'm Tammy Alexander, and I work for Mennonite Central Committee in the Washington, D.C. office on federal immigration policy. When I talk with churchgoers about immigration issues, one of the questions I often get asked is, undocumented immigrants. They're breaking the law, aren't they? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer is complicated. First, because about half of those who are currently in the U.S. actually came with legal documentation, such as a worker visa, a family-based visa, or a student or tourist visa. And certainly some of those folks have intentionally violated their visas, and some to avoid being separated from spouses and children, while others became undocumented because they made a mistake or their lawyers made a mistake with their paperwork. I've personally listened to immigrants tell their stories of how they tried to do everything the right way, and because they misfiled one piece of paperwork or because they got bad advice from a lawyer, they ended up undocumented, and some of them even detained or deported. Second, it's complicated because immigration violations are actually administrative infractions rather than criminal violations of the law. And what does that mean? Well, it means that immigration violations are in the same category as when you get a ticket for speeding or running a red light. It means that most immigration cases do not go through the federal criminal court system. They actually go through a separate administrative court system. It also means that immigrants, instead of being held in prisons, are held in immigrant detention centers. And you saw some of these immigrant detention centers on one of the previous videos. And from the outside, you can see they look very much like prisons. And I'm sure from the inside, they feel very much like prisons. But they actually were designed not to punish immigrants, but simply to hold people until they could be either released or deported. Unfortunately, now, though, immigrants are often held in these detention centers for months or even years. Now, it wasn't until 2005 that federal criminal penalties were introduced for immigration violations, specifically for crossing the border without documentation. And right now, for crossing the border a second time, you can be charged with that and spend up to 20 years in a federal prison. And you should understand that these federal prisons, many of the federal prisons, and many of the immigrant detention centers are owned by private prison companies who are profiting quite nicely from these harsh immigration laws. So it's not surprising at all to see them lobbying Congress for even tougher immigration laws. So yes, there are consequences to violating the law. But in a civilized society, we have a general rule that the consequences should fit the crime. When a mother with small children, who's no threat to her community, is deported because her papers aren't in order, is that justice? For who? When a pastor who's been here for 25 years is deported, is that justice? When a young man who risks his life crossing the desert to feed his family is caught and sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison, is that justice? Right now, there are an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S., and about 60% of those have been in the country for more than 10 years. More than 10 years. I want you to think about that for a minute. These aren't folks that crossed the border yesterday. They are people that have deep roots in their community. They have jobs, they have church membership, they have families. Many of them have children of their own. Many of them were brought to the U.S. as children themselves. I just read a story the other day about a young man who had been brought to the U.S. as a baby more than 20 years ago. And he now has children of his own. In fact, there was a picture of him in the story. He was holding his young daughter, who looked to be about 5 years old, the same age as my daughter. And he was deported. And he can't hold his daughter anymore. And I can't even imagine his pain. And so what about the young man in the desert who was trying to get to the U.S. in order to feed his family? He was breaking the law, right? Well, let me ask you what laws you would break to feed your family. Let's take a hypothetical situation for a minute. Let's just suppose that you live in the state of Indiana, and you are poor and you're struggling to feed your family. And maybe one of your children is even sick and needs medicine, but you can't afford to buy it. And let's say that your brother lives in Ohio and he found a job there and he says he can get you one too. Well, let's suppose that it's illegal for you to cross state lines to go work in Ohio. But your brother says, "Don't worry, I can sneak you in." What would you do? This is Lady. Lady's husband was deported. She and her children spiraled into homelessness before finally finding a roommate and an apartment. But the heat wasn't on, and it was the middle of winter. In order to turn on the heat, the local utility company required a Social Security number. So she lied on the application. She was caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison under a law passed largely to catch undocumented immigrants. She's now in danger of being deported once she gets out of prison. So Lady is a criminal. We heard from Danny Carroll the story of Abraham and Sarah lying when they were immigrants trying to escape a famine. We call Abraham and Sarah heroes. We call our own immigrant ancestors heroes for doing hard things to provide for their families. But we call Lady a criminal and take her away from her children and put her in jail. This is what we've come to. We are a nation that criminalizes a mother for trying to get the heat turned on. We are the Egyptians. And no, we don't kill babies like the story in Exodus, but we do take babies from their mothers and fathers. In fact, more than 5,000 children are in foster care in the US right now because one or both of their parents were deported. We deport about 1,000 immigrants every day on average from the US, and most of those pose no threat to their communities. Now, the Obama administration will lift up statistics and they'll say that most of the people they deport have criminal convictions. But if you look deeper into those statistics, you'll see that most of those are for crossing the border, like we talked about, or for document fraud, such as in cases like Lady's. We like to think of the US as a nation of laws, and as ourselves as people who respect those laws. And so we judge undocumented immigrants for breaking those laws. But then we don't judge ourselves as harshly for breaking God's laws. Welcome the stranger. Never forget that you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Dozens of places in the Bible, we are admonished to treat the immigrant with kindness and dignity, and we break those laws. So what would it look like if we were able to structure the U.S. immigration system closer to God's vision of radical hospitality and welcoming the stranger? Is there a way to create a more fair and just immigration system in the U.S.? Well, a number of years ago, Mennonite Central Committee developed 7 principles on just what such a system should look like. First, it should ensure a pathway to citizenship for those currently undocumented without unreasonable fines or other requirements. Second, it should maintain a family-based immigration system and make sure that families can immigrate together in a legal and timely way. For some families today, there are long wait lists, and for others, there is just no way to get to the U.S. to rejoin with family, and this has been a major cause of undocumented migration to the U.S. It should contain fair guest worker programs. Current programs are inadequate. They leave workers open to abuse and exploitation. They keep them separated from their families, and they typically offer no path to eventually become a citizen. It should ensure access to basic benefits. Lawfully present immigrants should have access to basic benefits and services. No one should be discouraged from seeking necessary health care or from going to the police to report a crime in their community. There should be an end to indiscriminate raids and detention. Workplace raids and mass detentions just create a culture of fear and harm entire communities. These resources could be much better spent focusing on drug, weapon, and human traffickers. We should choose smart and humane border security strategies. Border walls and increasing militarization along the border have separated communities, hurt businesses along the border, damaged the environment, put endangered species at risk, and have led to a drastic increase in the number of deaths of migrants crossing the border, which is now estimated to exceed 6,000. There are isolated examples of Border Patrol working with communities, businesses, or wildlife managers along the border to craft more effective and sensible strategies, but we need to do more to encourage this. And last but not least, we need to address the root causes of migration. People are willing to risk their lives to cross the desert because the alternative, poverty or persecution in their home country, is so bleak. We need to look at our own foreign policy and trade agreements and how those are driving migration. When there's economic opportunity and stability in your home country, you're a lot less likely to leave. Okay, so we have a general idea what we need to do to create a more fair and humane immigration policy for the United States. But you might ask next, what can I possibly do to change U.S. immigration laws? Well, unlike in the time of the pharaohs in Egypt, we live in a democracy today. And as those of us that are U.S. citizens, we have both the right and the responsibility to help craft a better society. We can hold our political leaders accountable when they create bad laws, when they enforce laws unjustly, or when they simply do nothing to fix a system that is clearly broken. As the Mennonite Confession of Faith says, "We witness to the nations by being that city on a hill, which demonstrates the way of Christ. We also witness by being ambassadors of Christ, calling the nations and all persons and institutions to move toward justice, peace, and compassion for all people. In doing so, we seek the welfare of the city to which God has sent us." So how do we do that? There are several small but significant things you can do to advocate for positive change. You can write a letter to your member of Congress or to the White House. You can send an email or make a quick phone call. You could also write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. You can engage with policymakers through social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. You can also visit your representative or senators in their local office when they're home during a congressional recess. But how do I know what to say and when to say it, you might ask? First, I want to say that you do not have to be an expert on immigration issues to contact your member of Congress. Even calling up your local office and telling them, "I want you to work to create a more fair and humane immigration system. As a person of faith, I believe that we need to do more to welcome the strangers in our communities, that we need to treat all people with respect and dignity. I read about stories of family separation in our local newspaper, and I'm just heartbroken when I see mothers being separated from their kids or fathers being taken from their kids. And I want you to do more to keep families together." I mean, that right there is a very effective message. And if you want to add more, you certainly can, though especially with letters and emails, it's best to keep them short and to the point. If you want to add a story, your own personal migration story, or one that you've heard, or even just a story that you have read in your local newspaper, those can help to make your point even more effectively. And as far as timing, there's one really easy thing you can do, and that's sign up for MCC Washington Office Action Alerts. We only send about 2 immigration action alerts per month on average, but it's a great way to find out about things like national call-in days, where you can add your voice to thousands of people across the country that are calling, national prayer vigils, also letter writing campaigns. We will send out resources such as sample letters, prayer and worship resources, links to educational webinars. Do my calls and letters make a difference? Yes, they do make a difference. Your silence also makes a difference, because when all members of Congress hear is negative messages about immigrants, they are not very inclined to work for immigration reform. In 2013, thousands of people of faith called the U.S. Senate and they said, "We want you to pass an immigration reform bill." And the Senate did. They passed a bipartisan immigration reform bill, 68-32, in June of that year. Now, that was not a perfect bill, but it did move us in the right direction. It did start to address some of those 7 principles that we laid out. It included a path to citizenship, and it contained some very good provisions for the farm workers who help put food on our tables. And it would have actually decreased the federal budget significantly. It also would have excluded, though, many undocumented immigrants, particularly those who are poor or who have even minor criminal convictions. It would have ended family migration for the siblings or adult married children of U.S. citizens. And it would drastically have increased militarization on the border. And it would have done nothing, absolutely nothing, to address the root causes of migration to the U.S. So yes, as Mennonites, we can and should speak into this debate. Whether you do something big or you do something small, just please do something. We all have migration stories in our history. It might be the story of our ancestors crossing land or sea borders. It might be our own stories of crossing national borders, or maybe our own stories of simply crossing from state to state within the U.S. but somewhere, sometime, we were strangers. And someone opened a door, offered help, showed a little kindness. Don't forget, you too were immigrants.